Welcome to Haul Around the World, presented by Crushing Comics. I'm your host, Crisis with a K, and I'm here in Wellington, New Zealand. And to get new books into my vast comic book collection here, they've got to get hauled around the world because not many comics originate in New Zealand. That's how all these other things got here with me. I hauled them from where I used to live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Today's haul, it's a small one. It's my February haul, and there's only 3 books. And the reason I do this is not to just show off books, everybody's got books, but to talk about them a little bit too. And I have one in particular to talk about today, which is this Morbius Epic Collection. Morbius is a little bit peculiar to get an Epic Collection because he never really had his own ongoing series into the 90s, and this starts with his material from the 70s, so what's in it should you care? We'll get to that in just a moment. My hauls these days, they're relatively small. And the reason is I have mostly switched to digital reading just because this all takes up so much room in my house. At some point, I had to make a decision. Am I going to keep buying new physical comic books? You know, during the Marvel Now period, I was literally buying every single trade paperback Marvel put out of new material, plus a lot of images output too. And there's boxes and boxes of it. And so now that I've got a haul all around the world and I'm thinking about like, where will all these boxes continue to live in my life? I've cut way down. But there are some indie series that I still buy physically, usually for one of 2 reasons. One reason is because I've just been buying them already and I want to complete the line, as with Birthright, which you've seen me talk about a lot of times because I buy every volume. And another one is because I like to read them with my family, specifically my daughter. And Lumberjanes fits into that category. Now, we are almost done physical collections of the main Lumberjanes series. Last year, it wrapped up with a double-sized issue number 75 and then a double-sized special, which were incredibly delightful. So this is the road up to that. It is volume number 17. It's called Smitten in the Stars. Lumberjanes has always taken what I think is a somewhat wise approach to release collections somewhat slowly, but on a regular pace. So they have released them more slowly than they have had new material, but that ensures they always have things out in the market. And of course, there's also Lumberjanes novels and Lumberjanes OGNs and all things of that nature as well. But this is just your standard Lumberjanes arc. I don't know if I would say that you should jump in here because it picks up some old Lumberjanes plot points. But you know, something about it actually made me a little bit more charmed than I had been the last year or 2 of Lumberjanes. I started to feel like the figures were all just looking kind of like blobs, like they didn't have anything physically distinct about them. And if you go back and look at early Lumberjanes, or especially even the covers, which don't tend to be by the interior artists, the figures tend to be really, really unique from each other. They're very different shapes and sizes in that enjoyable, cartoonish way where not everybody has to be a realistic body shape. And I feel like this started ticking a little bit back towards that, and the last arc had that too. I keep saying I'm sad to be parenting in a world that doesn't have Lumberjanes anymore. I think it's a totally adorable book. This particular one is fun because it has to do with Norse mythology, and Lumberjanes all along has actually had a lot of mythology in it, opening up right from the beginning. It has Greek mythology, and there's a lot of things about, you know, North American cryptids, a lot of things about other cultures' mythologies and legends that this camp for girls is kind of just the center of. So it's always fun to see them pull something new in. And clearly I've read it already because I actually do read it in digital, but then they're all in the bedroom down the hall on my kids' bookshelf as well. So that's my indie comic here. I have 2 Epic collections, the Morbius collection and one other. It is Luke Cage Epic Collection number 1. It's volume 1 from 1972 to 1975. It's called Retribution. Now, we've had this Luke Cage content in color before. It is in a Marvel Masterworks, which is up there on my shelf. And at the time, that was something to really celebrate because we hadn't had it in color yet to that point. But now he's being covered by the Epic Collections as well. I think it's kind of weird timing because he's not very high profile right now. It's not like he's in the MCU. In comics, he's guest starring in an Iron Fist series right now, but it's not really a time where Luke Cage is really out there. And usually Marvel does time their Epic Collections to some kind of media exposure for their character somewhere, which is how we got this Morbius collection, because there's a movie. Who knows if it'll ever come out, but that's why we got it. But of course, I'm happy to have it in any other color format, especially because Masterworks get really hard to get a hold of after they've been out for a while. So this is something that's going to be a lot more affordable and a lot more available for fans. Now, do I know this material particularly well? I don't. I've paged through it for a guide, and you'll hear me say that a lot, like, oh, I only know this from a guide. When I make a guide for a character on crushingcrisis.com, I have usually paged through every comic that they've made an appearance in. If they have their own comic where they appear in every issue, maybe I've paged through every 2 or 3, but that's why I have a lot of this collection. It's why I have Marvel Unlimited, because I like to verify things so my guides can be the right guides. So I can't really tell you a lot about this Luke Cage collection. It's super colorful, it's very 70s, and it collects Heroes for Hire, or Hero, singular hero, because he's the one, Hero for Hire 1 through 16, and then the title changes to Power Man, and it collects Power Man 17 through 23. So one more volume of this epic collection might actually do it. I think there's 3. I'm trying to see where it is behind me. Yes, there are 3 collections of him in Marvel Masterworks that collect all the way up to the end of his series, which is number 47 in Annual 1. And then, of course, it turns into Power Man and Iron Fist, but the numbering continues from his solo series. So I can't make a strong suggestion for that one. But here's our other favorite question. How do I think the build is? I think it is a pretty nice gluing. The cover board is fine. The pages are nice. I can't complain about this. There's a little bit of show as I turn, but again, show, not a terrible thing. It's just a thing that paper does. You don't want to see through the page when it's laying flat. You don't want to see through the page through colors that aren't white, but it's just the nature of paper that you're going to get a little bit of show. I think this is pretty well put together, honestly. I can't complain about this. I'm really curious to see if it's from Fry, LSC, or Salisco, who are the 3 that they've been using recently. It is from, and you can see this in the indicia on the bottom of the second page, Fry Communications, created between December and January 2020 into 2021. So this is a good build quality, and if you've always wanted to read old Luke Cage, go for it. Now, it does have a little bit of like a 70s blaxploitation vibe to it, so you have to kind of like that, and you're going to cringe at a lot of things that you're like, wow, I cannot believe people are putting these words into Luke Cage's mouth from like a 2021 perspective, especially because, if I'm not mistaken, it is largely a white writing team. Billy Graham does write an issue at some point or do some co-writing. He penciled it. But Archie Goodwin, Steve Englehart, Tony Isabella. But now let's move on to Morbius, which I actually did spend some time with. I know, unusual for me. I actually read some of the Epic Collection when it got here. But that's because I don't know a lot about Morbius. Honestly, when my first encounter with him, I maybe had some 90s Morbius. I'm sure we'll come across it if we do in my other shelf store stall. I'm gesturing to all the short boxes everywhere arrayed around the room. But I don't know that I actually like really read him. He was just one other chapter in some Ghost Rider crossover to me back in the 90s. I feel like the first time I read him is there was like a 0.1 issue of Amazing Spider-Man, either 699.1 or 700.1, maybe right before it turned into Superior, where they kind of did a soft launch of a Morbius series that wound up being in Marvel Now, written by Joe Keating. And that was my first experience with him. Like, I didn't know, and I had cards of him, probably. I have all those like Fleer Ultra Marvel cards from the 90s. So I knew he wasn't like a vampire, that it was like a mad science thing, as many of Spider-Man's villains are. But I really didn't know anything about him. And so anything I've learned about him has just been over the past decade. And I still don't know a lot about him. So in this epic collection, it's Morbius Volume 1. It's called The Living Vampire. It collects material from 1971 to 1975. Here's the thing. The material itself is interesting because Morbius started as a Spider-Man character. He's on a very famous cover on his first issue here, batting Spider-Man away. And so the question a lot of people have when these epics come out that have characters that originated in other runs is this really going to duplicate some other epic that I already have, right? Like, a lot of people ask that with Venom. And then sometimes it comes out on the opposite side. Like Wolverine, you could have easily done a Wolverine Volume 1 that had some key Uncanny X-Men Wolverine stories and his original 1982 miniseries, and they didn't. And then some fans were like, well, I really wanted that, so I can have a complete Wolverine shelf. So there's people on both sides of the should epics duplicate things in other epic lines. This has ultimately really only 3 issues that are definitely going to be in the Amazing Spider-Man epic line. Morbius originates in Amazing Spider-Man 101 and 102, and those are in here. It's his first story. It makes sense that they're here. They are in the Amazing Spider-Man epic line, of course, because they are issues of Amazing Spider-Man. He also has a focus story in Giant Size Superheroes #1. I was not familiar with this title. Is it like kind of an abortive anthology-esque title that Marvel was going to do, and then there wound up not being any more more issues of it. So I had to look it up, and that has been included in the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus line and in the Amazing Spider-Man Masterwork. So it is absolutely going to turn up in Epics too. So there's 3 issues there that you know are going to show up in Epics. But then what is the rest of this? Well, it has Marvel Team Up 3 and 4, which is an early Marvel Team Up story of Spider-Man first, Spider-Man and the Human Torch versus Morbius, and then Spider-Man and the X-Men versus Morbius. Although I am not familiar with it, I think it's before Giant Size, so it's still the Silver Age team in those gap years. Yeah, so here it is, and it says the X-Men, but it seems like mostly it's Angel, although they say they're all new and back in action. Spider-Man and the X-Men. So those would be in a Marvel Team Up Epic Collection line if they even do one. We don't have one yet, but there has been a Masterworks line, and there is a Marvel 2-in-1 Epic line, so we do kind of assume there's going to be a Marvel Team Up Epic line as well, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to start from the first volume. It doesn't, but if it does, the first volume will have that. Great, so maybe there's 5 things that'll be duplicated. But then here's the other things, and here's what's interesting. There is Fear 20 through 26, and Morbius was the feature story in Fear. So that's 7 issues that he pretty much was having his own story. These are in color, and they are just his own story adventuring on his own. Additionally, he was a backup feature in Vampire Tales 1 through 8, which was a black and white magazine that featured vampire and horror stuff in the 70s, including some Dracula stories. And here is one truly spectacular spread from that. So you're getting, so that's only 1 story each, but they were magazines, so it's not like the story is just 4 pages because of the backup. It's pretty substantial. So that's, and it also is a story from Giant Size Werewolf by Night number 4. But you're really mostly buying this if you already maybe have that Spider-Man material for the Fear stories and the Vampire Tales stories. So what are they? I spent some time reading the Vampire Tales stories, and I think a lot of Marvel magazine stuff from the 70s gets the reputation that since it's in black and white and it was in magazine, it was like super violent, or it was like doing something to really get around the comics code at the time. I wouldn't say that these come off as super violent. The thing that all the stories have in common is that it's much more explicit about when he bites somebody, and it's usually women. And so, not explicit, like sexually explicit, just like you really see him sinking his teeth into a neck, which is something that I think that they would try to avoid in most of the color comics at that time. So there's that. And then also the Vampire Tales stories really emphasize kind of the ooky creature side of Morbius. Like, again, he's a lab-based vampire, because just like the lizard is a lab-based lizard, and many other Spider-Man villains are kind of lab-created versions of whatever animals that they, Spider-Man himself is, right? And so it really plays with this idea of like body horror and all of these other horrors that he's encountering, but they're actually scientific horrors, and can he cure them? Should he cure them? Should he fight them? Do they have any blood? Because could he just bite them and drain them of their blood, and it's like a victimless crime as far as he's concerned. So that is what the Vampire Tales stories have. And then, honestly, the Fear stories are not so different. They're just like maybe a little bit less directly tooth on neck, I guess. And also Blade is in some of them as well. The other cool thing that this does is it actually intersperses some of the vampire stories with some of the color stories so that they are in the right order to each other. I think it actually only does it once now that I've said that, which is fun. You know, I kind of like that the Epic Collections generally will take the perspective of putting things in the correct publication order and in the correct order of reading as well. One or the other, sometimes both. The other thing I would say is that some of this black and white material, it's like on the sketchier side of black and white. For every page like this that has really heavy inks on a black and white page, there's also some black and white that's a lot more delicate, which I would say this is a little bit delicate. And I don't know if that's just the scan quality or if that's also, you know, the style of the originals, because I've never seen nor touched the originals. So should you buy this book? Here's the thing. Morbius, you either like him or you don't. He's a character that I don't find super, super compelling on his own, because it's like, okay, he's the scientist vampire guy, so what? So to me, the trick of Morbius is like, is the material good? Because all on his own, he's not as compelling as, say, a Spider-Man to me. And I do think if you like 70s horror mag kind of material, this material is compelling. It's not the same as Marvel superhero material from the 70s, like in Luke Cage. So if you like that kind of pulp horror stuff, I really think that you could enjoy this Morbius book. I would recommend it. If you don't, but you're really curious about Morbius and you're into the Sony Spider-Man movies and you want to see the movie, sure, get it. I mean, you could always sell it later, I suppose. It's interesting enough. You'll get a grounding in who he was in the comic books. I know that they have an omnibus of this material. I can't see myself with this Morbius prestige format omnibus, taking it on and off the shelf, flipping through it all the time. I'm sure there's people who are obsessed with Morbius out there who want this Fear material and oversized. I have no shame for them. I think that's awesome. I love a lot of older comics too. But to me, this Epic Collection is the right size and the right format to collect this classic material in the all in one place, all at one time. But if you're not into Morbius, and if you're not into that 70s pulp stuff, I really think this is an Epic Collection you probably could skip. That's just my perspective. I happen to like the pulp stuff, so paging through it for me was actually really exciting. So that's it. That's for my haul today, except I do have one more book that hauled around this time, but I'm going to devote its own episode to it. And that is still on the shrink wrap here, because I haven't even stretched it out. Uncanny X-Men by Chris Claremont. Omnibus Volume 4. It collects Uncanny X-Men 176 through 193, and I have a lot of opinions on this Uncanny X-Men run, not only in general, but because I've reread it extremely recently. So tune in for the next haul around the world and hear all about my thoughts on this Uncanny X-Men Omnibus. I'd love to know if you decided for yourself that you'd be picking up that Morbius book either before hearing from me or after hearing from me, and also if you have thoughts on Luke Cage or Lumberjanes, I'd like to hear that too. But until next time, I've been your host, Crisis with a K. This has been Haul Around the World, and I very much hope that you are well.